Three, two, one, here we go. Hello, everyone. I'm Brian, the Rain Man Lucas. Welcome to RAINMAN'S Take, observations on the world we live in. We're going to take a deeper dive into topics of interest to me, including politics, current events, history, popular culture, and social issues. You'll find the diversity of topics refreshing. In our clickbait, soundbite society, we rarely get the whole story. RAINMAN'S Take interviews interesting people as well as peeling back the onion on specific topics, all with the goal of getting people to think more deeply about a subject. Hey everybody, it's the Rain Man. My guest today is Nick Leibham. I brought Nick on today for my first in-studio interview, so thanks very much, Nick.
My pleasure.
The maiden voyage. Nick and I are going to talk all things politics and all things Washington, D.C. today. So, Nick, why don't we go ahead? Let's start by just kind of telling us what you do now, how you got into it, and then from there we'll take it from there.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. It's always a delight to get together with you, especially over, we'll call it coffee. So I'm a partner at the law firm of K&L Gates. K&L Gates is a very large international firm. We're approximately 45 offices, about 1,700 lawyers around the world, 5 continents. And I am in principally the Washington, D.C. office in the Public Policy and Regulatory Group, and I co-head the Emerging Technologies and Innovation sub-practice. And in that capacity, I principally represent technology companies before the federal government.
Okay.
So procurements, public-private partnerships, if you're looking to lobby the Congress, if you're looking to negotiate a deal with the Department of Defense, you might come find somebody like myself.
Now, how'd you get into that?
Oh God, questioning all of my life decisions, right? So, should I start from the beginning?
So, if I remember correctly, you used to work. What was it? Did you work for? You used to work for a politician. Is that how you got to DC? And then, so to maybe talk a little bit about that, and then how that kind of morphed into the job that you're currently doing now. Because I would assume, obviously, you leave the politician with a Rolodex of connections that probably made it kind of a natural fit to just. Is that kind of how that worked, or?
Not exactly. You have the gist of it. So I was a very, very poor student. But at some point in college, it sort of dawned on me that I would, no longer be able to make a living off of playing professional water polo, and started to buckle down in class. The only thing that I was ever sort of interested in all that much was sort of in the political science, history, sociology space. And so I started to drill, into that, and actually tried to focus and become, at least somewhat substantive and knowledgeable.
Yeah.
That sort of cascaded into a series of, small jobs, junior city council aide, and, researcher for this, that, or the other nonprofit group. Eventually, I landed a position working on a congressional campaign, which morphed into me going into Washington, D.C., working for a member of Congress, and then sort of in my first life in politics, I ran the West. I was the Western Regional Director for the Democratic National Committee,
Okay.
so I had jurisdiction, if you will, over about 13 states. This was a lifetime ago.
Yeah.
This was like 2001.
Okay.
But then I actually decided to go to law school, and I thought that I was done with politics, and immediately after law school I was a prosecutor for the state of California. And after doing that for a few years, I had my own legal shop, and I say only half jokingly, a fit of insanity, I ran for the United States Congress and was the Democratic nominee for Congress in 2008 in California's 50th Congressional District.
Okay.
So I ran against a gentleman by the name of Brian Bilbray.
Yeah.
And came up a little bit short. I believe the numbers were somewhere around 50.1 to 45.6. But in life, sometimes you win for losing. And I ended up immediately thereafter at the law firm, and been there ever since.
Okay.
And so, there's an element of, background. There's an element of, as you point out, knowing who's who and what's what.
Yeah.
And there's always an element I've found of luck. I'd much rather be lucky than good.
Absolutely, absolutely. And actually, if we've got time today, and if we don't, we'll definitely have to have you back. But I definitely want to touch on that whole experience of running for Congress, because actually, I did a podcast a while back with a friend of mine who just kind of. It was just this early on this year for the primary for California 53, and he got in kind of at the last minute and tried, and it was fascinating to talk to somebody who had never been in politics to get his take on what that was like. So, if you got time, if not, we'll definitely get into that down the road. All right, so you're basically have been in politics. It sounds like in one way or the other most of your adult life. So you leave politics, you get to the law firm. Now, this is something that you and I were talking about in pre-production here. Are you a lobbyist, and if so, or if not, what exactly is the difference between what you do and what, let's say, a lobbyist does?
Sure. So, and do me a favor, don't edit this part out.
Okay.
So my comments here today, my opinions are my own, not my law firm's.
Gotcha.
And they will want to hear that sort of disclaimer. You can appreciate. So obviously I'm a lawyer by background. I am a lobbyist by registration.
Okay.
Under the Lobbying Disclosure Act, those who otherwise have very specific interactions with public officials are obligated to publicly report those to the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate. And so, I have, in fact, a whole team that makes sure that I am on the straight and narrow as it concerns that. And I would say that probably about, half of my portfolio in any given time of the year is doing real sort of legal work. It's boardroom governance issues. Right now I have 2 active pieces of litigation that I am substantively involved in. And I'm probably going to end up in Texas shortly after the 4th of July to do, depositions. The other half of my portfolio is what you would consider to be in the public policy space. So what I really do at the end of the day in Washington, D.C. is I am sort of the outsourced executive vice president for strategy and business development in the federal marketplace, or in the governmental marketplace more generally. Just as you would probably go to an expert or a market strategist if you were looking to go to Brazil to sell your wares, because that person would probably know what do the customers think here. Like what's the nomenclature? What's the language? What do people actually care about? It's the same in Washington, D.C. It's a multi-trillion-dollar economic landscape. And I end up facilitating, typically on behalf of technology firms, although not exclusively, how to navigate that marketplace that has its own drivers. And so if you're looking to sell to the government, if you're looking for a public-private partnership, if you were looking to make a tax change, if you're looking to negotiate a deal with the Department of Defense, you might come find somebody like me. Not because necessarily I know an immense amount about your product, or maybe even your industry, but I know about governments as a marketplace. That's sort of what I do.
And so, and again, if I'm asking questions that you can't answer for whatever reason, that's totally fine. I'm just gonna throw it out there. So, are you? Somebody hires you. Are you? What's your role? Do you go and get them meetings with the politicians that they're interested in talking to about their product, or are you negotiating on that company's behalf and there's no representative from that company, or is it you guys go in with them to somebody's office and then pitch whatever it is that they're pitching? Is that how that works?
Yes.
Okay.
So look, somebody may engage me during the entire marketplace activity or on various segments. So the life cycle, that marketplace activity can typically include: what is the marketplace? What are its drivers? Where are the opportunities? Once we've identified those opportunities, how do you otherwise shape and mold whatever it is you're doing, your product, your service, to fit the solution or the mandate that the government is looking for? Putting together the various, collateral documents or other, data or information, making sure that your client is otherwise prepped in order to go do that meeting, doing the meetings. And as we know in life, just like in Washington, D.C., it's almost all follow through, right? Yeah. Making sure that, the customer otherwise has whatever it is they need in order to make, an educated and informed decision. Yeah. And then, if you get lucky and there's a dialogue, a secondary conversation, playing, if you will, traditional lawyer. Negotiating those agreements, making sure that everything is in place, for your clients. Right. At that point in time, typically, I exit. I'm not an operations guy. Nobody's coming to me in order to, build the widget or typically provide the service. It is the entire sort of front end of doing the market research. It's putting together the strategy in order to capture the opportunity. It's how do you tactically execute? Who are the right personnel in order to populate that effort? Yeah. And then obviously there's an entire legal component. Right. That's sort of what I do.
So your end state, your success is your client, your whatever that technology is, gets a contract with the government.
It can be a contract. Gotcha. Sometimes, so I spent the last 2 to 3 days, many hours this last 2 or 3 days, pouring through a both House and Senate legislative proposal that would otherwise provide somewhere north of $20 billion for the domestic production of semiconductors and other critical microelectronics. Okay? So talking with my clients, talking with congressional staff, talking with folks in the administration about what it is they're trying to solve for. Okay. And I can tell you over this last couple of days, and I'm not betraying any confidences, and you can Google all of this. Yeah. The United States government writ large, both the Congress and the executive branch, Democrats, Republicans, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, the whole lot of them have come to, I think, the recognition and realization that we have largely offshored we have offshored critical capabilities, technologies, and innovation, to wit, if we otherwise want to make sure that they are here and available, safe, secure, and we know their provenance, we need to make sure that domestically we're able to manufacture them. Yeah. Okay? That's going to take some money, because a lot of that work, especially in what's called the digital realm, has migrated to Asia over the course of the last 20 years. And so how is it that you incentivize the manufacturing of those identified critical capabilities? How do you bring those folks back onshore, provide those jobs here, and that sort of safety and security of the industrial-based supply chain? That's what I've actually been doing the last 3 days.
Well, you're hearing all about it on the news. Larry Kudlow, a couple weeks ago, was talking about, one of the ideas that they had was pay those companies, actually pay them to move back. And that's actually fascinating, because I've got a very good friend of mine who is in high-tech software type business, and all of their manufacturing is done in India. And India's been shut down. I mean, literally, I think they shut down the entire country for the month of April. And so he's like, I'm screwed. Waiting for so I'd be interested to get your take on what do you think that what's the probability of that actually happening, and how much do you think could come back to America? And then on top of that, obviously there's going to be a price increase because our labor is more expensive than theirs. I've seen polls that show that Americans would be willing to pay more for that, but what's going on behind the curtain?
So can I back up a little bit and maybe
Absolutely.
provide a little bit of historical context? So over the course of the last 70 years, there has been, if you will, this neoliberalist consensus that the free flow of information, the free flow of capital, the free flow of personnel, the free flow of trade is otherwise good for everybody. That everybody, sort of a rising tide floats all boats.
You call that the globalist?
It's the globalization. It's the globalization of not only America but the world. It's a globalist viewpoint, right? I would otherwise tell you that at no point in the last 70 years has that viewpoint, which was largely consensus, has it been more challenged than it is today.
I bet.
And I would otherwise tell you that those that would otherwise advocate for more directed nationalist policies, policies which are, and I don't mean this pejoratively at all, more inward looking, more sort of how does America or France or Britain or China or anybody else, how do you otherwise preserve all of your various optionality that you currently have, but do it in a way where you know that your supply chains are not vulnerable to disruption, whether or not that's geopolitical disruption, whether or not that is due to military disruption, pandemic disruption, whatever.
Yeah.
That's a conversation that we have been having for a number of years. I mean, Donald Trump, in no small part, ran on that as one of his major pillars of his platform. I think got a lot of traction, especially amongst various traditional Democratic constituencies. I would tell you that while the argument is certainly not ended, those that would otherwise advocate for a retreat from the globalization and international marketplace, their voice is ascendant. And I otherwise think that over the course of the next just several years, we're bound to see a focus on the reshoring and onshoring of what America policymakers and industry says are critical capabilities. It's probably always going to be okay that all of my patio furniture comes from China.
Right.
It's probably not going to be okay that my most sophisticated microelectronics are derivative of Asia.
Right.
I think the really interesting thing that's going to happen is, what about those things sort of in the middle? Whether or not you're talking about specialty alloys, specialty metals, permanent magnets, even quite frankly, latex gloves and masks. Like, we offshore that low margin, inconsequential business pretty much decades ago.
Right.
I think that there's going to be an active rethinking and looking at specific products and services.
Yeah. And my guess is anything that you can say has a military application is going to like you were talking about microprocessors, anything that goes into a missile or a weapon. I mean, when you think about it, in that sense, you're like, God damn, it seems like we're really exposed, to somebody just shutting the door on something like that. Like you said, what about the middle of the road stuff like an iPhone or something like that isn't necessarily national security, but they make a gazillion of them, and they could probably hire a lot of people here, I guess. So I find that fascinating. Let me ask you this.
Sure.
So, kind of getting back to kind of what you do and what your focus is. So I've heard, there's no smoke. Now is the secret will be out now. Is you and I have different political views. So
There's a secret out?
Well, they don't know that.
Now you've told them.
Exactly. So one of the big things that I seem to remember a lot of talk about when Obamacare was going through, and it was that major battle, was that the insurance companies had a lot of input into that bill. As in, they were doing most of the writing of it. And so, and this is what I want to ask you, is as a lobbyist, is it that, I wouldn't call it nefarious, but are they that involved in like policy type stuff?
So let me say a few things on that. One, during my entire tenure at the law firm, I have only barely touched healthcare related issues or policy.
Right.
Like, it's not my bag. I am not an expert. In fact, I have sort of consciously begged off of it because I don't have a lot of interest in, as a professional matter, diving in. So let me just say that. But I will riff, and I will tell you this. One of the more interesting, I think it was 2008 vignettes, was when Hillary Clinton said an absolute truth and was absolutely pilloried for it. She was at some town hall in, Iowa or New Hampshire or one of these. And she made some quip in response to a question as it concerns lobbying and lobbyists. And she said, and I'm not going to quote because I don't remember the quote, essentially, lobbyists represent real people. They represent cops and nurses and firefighters and, yes, Fortune 500 CEOs, and to your point, Brian, insurance companies, but also, much like your wife, doctors who are immensely important, hospital systems, diagnostic technology companies. And so, while I appreciate, as an old political hack, the ability to cast aspersions and cast mud and be able to say, oh, it's the lobbyists' fault, they're distorting democracy. The fact of the matter is, there are only 3 professions in the Bill of Rights that are actually enshrined. Can you name them? Okay. First Amendment, I'll give you a hint. 3 professions.
So what would be clergy?
Yeah, 1.
Okay. Give me some clues for the other 2. I would assume lobbyist is another.
No, you would be correct. The right of the governed of the people to petition their government, and the other, of course, being the press, essentially being a reporter.
Yeah.
Those are the 3 things that the founders actually said to government: "Thou shalt not infringe."
Interesting, because lobbyists get a bad rap in general.
Yeah, I mean, we're easy prey and target, right? Like, yes, we've got our own trade association, but
evil. Come on.
Yeah, right.
Now that,
we're it.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Well, there you go. Look at that. Learn something new. All right, so let's kind of pivot off that, and let's kind of just start working off of just your general experience of Washington and how it works. So, give me a couple of things that we kind of talked about in pre-production here that I personally find fascinating is policy versus politics. What was kind of what's your take on that? And maybe we can talk probably some current examples of that. But
sure.
What is the difference? What does that mean? Policy versus politics.
Sure. Maybe I would ask you, if you don't mind sort of framing it. I would be interested in your sort of definition, and then I'll give you mine.
So, politics to me is the bullshit that we see on television. the left thinks the right's completely wrong, the right thinks the left's completely wrong. That's politics. Policy would be, how are we going to handle repatriating those companies away from China? We all get together. I would assume that's probably a relatively bipartisan issue. So when they get together and make an official stance of how the United States is going to handle that, that would be policy.
Okay.
And that's
pretty good.
That's the extent of it.
It's pretty good.
Yeah.
So like when somebody says to me politics, it is multi-layered and multi-dimensional. I don't actually know what that means without sort of tugging at those threads.
Yeah.
It could mean the act of campaigning. It could be the process of raising money. It could mean, going out there and doing, as they say, retail politics, such as what we saw in Iowa during the Democratic primaries, and go knocking door to door and making phone calls in what equates to a boiler room.
Yeah.
Politics could be, and what I oftentimes see and think about is, what is the intersection point of various interests? I otherwise think of politics, and much of my job, very frankly, is why is it that anybody should care what it is Nick has to say or about his clients? Nobody in Washington, D.C. with any degree of authority, nobody does anything because Nick Leibham has asked them to.
Yeah.
They do something because it's in their own interest to do so. And whether or not that is because it's a Defense Department official that is otherwise obligated to help shore up the defense industrial base for critical manufacturing around specialty alloys, which is something I'm doing right now.
Yeah.
Whether or not that is a member of Congress that would otherwise like to see a special tax provision inserted within legislation to the benefit of one of the state's largest employers, something else I'm working on.
Yeah.
It's because I've been able to present a striking and cogent argument as to why it is they should care. They've got a constituent interest. Yeah. As a substantive matter, they're interested in sort of seeing through the initiative, right? Mm-hmm. Policy, I think you're spot on, right? Like, what should be the right policy, vis-a-vis the, what I believe to be, and I know you don't, the threat of global climate change. What should be the right policy and disposition as we're countering, Russia and China and others in cyberspace? Yes, politics can enter into that as well. But it's, at least to my mind, a little bit easier to define down and sort of talk about. You can't completely and totally read politics out of that.
Right.
And each policy invariably has its own politics associated with it.
Yeah.
Democrat, Republican, hawk, dove, deficit, control hawk versus, somebody maybe of a more, liberal spending fashion.
Yeah.
But that's generally how I sort of think about policy and politics. It's not, you can't ever, in my world, in what I do, sort of stop at that query and say, what is politics versus, policy? It's just not. It's not that direct. It doesn't reveal itself immediately.
Yeah. Well, and what about ideology, partisanship? I mean, you hear that right now. It seems like camps are so ensconced in their own positions that I don't see it moving to the middle anytime soon. So, what is your take on both of those? And then, based on your interactions in DC, is it as bad as the people on the outside looking in think it is? And then, on top of that, do you see it moving back to the center at any time soon?
So I would ask you again, like, what's your sort of take on partisanship versus ideology? Do you have sort of a definition in your head as to how they should be viewed, or how you categorize them?
Yeah, I would say the way I would describe that would be an ideologue is going to be hyper-partisan, meaning they're not even wanting to listen to the other side. Now, somebody can be partisan, but be pragmatic as well, in which case, then yeah, maybe they would listen to the other side. So, for instance, I'd love to see it, I don't ever see it happening, is like AOC and Dan Crenshaw from the congressman from Texas, from Houston. He seems like, although he's a Republican, he seems very pragmatic. Whereas I can't even see her even wanting to engage with a guy like that. What do you think? In terms of the ideology and the partisan
So
argument.
I'm going to refrain from, I think, commenting on AOC, and I don't know enough about
And I can do it because I'm the host.
Yeah, sure.
And you're a respected politician. No, I'm kidding. So, continue.
And I don't know enough about Dan Crenshaw to otherwise have an educated opinion.
Gotcha.
So partisans are strong supporters in causes, individuals, clubs, political parties. Ideology is really a set of, beliefs and philosophies. And so you can be, if you will, a good partisan, right? The French were partisans on behalf of America during the Revolutionary War. Right? I would otherwise argue substantially the whole of the United States of America for close to 50 years was ideologically opposed to communism writ large.
Yeah.
So partisanship and being, having an ideology or being an ideologue doesn't necessarily mean, in my view, that you're a negative, or that your viewpoint, beliefs, subscriptions should otherwise be dismissed. Now, have we otherwise seen a hyper-partisanship over the course of the last, call it, 30 years that only seems to accelerate? And I sort of say 30 years because that is really the longest tail, at least in my experience, that I can put on. And actually, I should probably say 25 years. Yes, I mean, I originally got to Washington, D.C. when they were impeaching the president.
Clinton.
President Clinton.
Yeah, okay.
And so it wasn't exactly a time of, Christmas cards and, good tidings to all.
Yeah.
But the level of work, if you will, that was still being conducted, between the parties and the individual representatives of those parties, like, the train was still moving down the tracks. Didn't always go smoothly, but like stuff was happening.
Yeah.
I think that the level of partisanship today has grown to such a level that that track is now fairly severely compromised and encumbered, to the point where those of us who are back there and actually know what it's like to see a somewhat functioning bureaucracy in government, I can tell you this, it's probably worse than you think it is. Because
that's depressing.
That is depressing because like what you see is news clips, and whether or not that be on CNN or Fox, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, whatever. Yeah. What I oftentimes see in addition to all of that is how various government mechanisms and levers that are supposed to just sort of work irrespective of Democrat versus Republican are not working or getting bogged down.
What's an example of that? Can you give me one? Or?
Trying to think what it is I might be able to tell you without betraying any client promises. That's Let me maybe think about
Yeah,
that in the
absolutely.
background and come back to it.
Yeah, perfect. Let's do this. What do you think? Where do you think it's going to be in 5 years from now? I mean, is there a chance for things to move back into the middle? What's your take, having being on the ground and knowing what you know about DC?
Well, with the disclaimer that my magic 8 ball is broken, right? I can see it. I'll give you a typical lawyer's answer. Like, it depends.
Yeah.
I could see it both ways. I think that we are approaching a time of fundamental reassessment, as a society, frankly, on things like race relations, on things like income inequality, on global supply chains and global business dealings versus somewhat of a more domestic and U.S. centric focus. I think that we're going to be fundamentally rethinking things like education and how it is you otherwise put forward various knowledge and data so that the next generation can, not only, get out there and do what it is they need to do, but also sort of be a success in this world. So there's an opportunity to come together to forge some sort of consensus. That's what I like to think.
Yeah.
But as somebody who, again, has been involved in politics for substantially all of his adult life, and sort of one way or the other, like I took a hiatus here and I had a hiatus there, I would also say, and I would have expected that after 9/11, we had an opportunity which seemed to have passed, in the blink of an eye. There was a moment of bonhomie with, the first African American being elected, president in 2009. That, withered in a moment. It seemed. This global pandemic might have also been another instance where the country could have rallied. Either as a grassroots, movement or amongst policy leaders. That has clearly not happened without sort of, assigning blame. And I otherwise have my own opinions on that. But that is not happening. So, the global COVID-19 pandemic is not, in my view, going to be a catalyst for folks coming together, rolling up their sleeves, and having, real substantive discussions where they're sort of negotiating and, frankly, trading away things that they would otherwise like to see. I don't see that happening.
That's a bummer.
Yeah.
God dang it.
I guess if you force me into a decision, and again, I can see both sides of the coin, I would probably say I don't know when the fever ends.
Gotcha. Let me ask you this. I'm a firm believer in term limits. Do you think something like that, where maybe somebody's in there for 3 or 4 years, and they start to lay the roots down? Like, you got to pull Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi. You got to pull miles of roots out of them. But some of the younger ones, who it just seems to me that the longer that they get in there, the more entrenched they become in the status quo. I get that. What do you think? Would that help at all? I mean, is that just getting fresh blood in there to give new perspectives, or is it still? Are we still that far away on both sides that you still don't see it happening?
So I'm going to ask you. Let's tee up this discussion. Let's say that you are otherwise in charge, you, Brian, with picking an executive business team to run a $3.5 trillion business.
Yeah.
Fairly substantial. Year upon year out,
Yeah.
this business does $3.5 trillion, approximately. $100 billion there, $200 billion there. You get the point. And you've got a good squad. Due to nothing that they've done wrong, but only due to 3 years is up and you're out, would you want to otherwise undertake a revamping of that $3.5 trillion enterprise simply because their tenure was up?
So the answer to that is no, because a public company or a private company, regardless of whether or not they're traded on the stock exchange, a private company, their job is to make whatever it is and make as much as they can doing that.
Yep.
Our government's job is to basically move this behemoth down the center of the alley and not hitting gutter balls. Right now, it seems like we're banging back and forth across the gutter, and that's not doing anything either, right? So my answer is, in the government, yes, I think that would be helpful. And maybe it's not, 3 years is too short, I agree. But 10, I mean, that's pretty,
So let's
40 is insane.
let's use your analogy.
Yeah,
Okay. So the private company or the public, company.
the for-profit.
Yeah, the for-profit entity. And those executives are otherwise obligated as a fiduciary matter to, maximize the return, maximize the profit for the shareholder.
Yeah.
So let's take that, the next step. And those shareholders, mind you, can always vote out that executive
Yeah.
or that executive team, sometimes multiple times of the year.
Yeah.
I would otherwise suggest to you that I'm not in favor of term limits. I think that we have term limits for members of Congress, the House of Representatives, every 2 years. We have a term limit for the president every 4 years and a maximum of 8.
Right.
We have a term limit every 6 years for the United States Senate. All of those senators, every 100 of them comes up every 6 years, and governors every 4. In some instances, like Virginia, you only get every 4 years.
Yeah.
And so I would otherwise tell you that much like, investors can, either vote with their feet and sell, or vote on their proxy statements against the executive ranks, the United States public can vote against whomever is representing them in DC or their representative state capital.
However, my particular, and yes, I when I say term limits, that's what I meant, a maximum number of terms. I completely understand that they have to get reelected. But it's interesting that only the president is the only one of the 3 branches that actually has a maximum duration of terms, which I find interesting. The other thing, and this is kind of why my personal opinion on, and and maybe this is incorrect, lobbyists, i.e. money, influence in politics, and just the general trend that an incumbent usually wins. That to me is the problem, or that is one of the problems that I see about DC, being as skeptical as I am of it. That to me is one of the problems that forces, or not forces, but just the natural tendency of somebody who's in there for a long time to get comfortable in that position. So the sense of taking a risk to go talk to somebody on the other side of the aisle doesn't necessarily have, there's no reason to take, why? You know what I'm saying? So that was my only kind of reasoning about that. But so I don't know. It seems to me, in my personal opinion, is that it's getting back to what I said. Yes, I understand the idea that this trillion-dollar behemoth needs to be going in the right direction and needs to be as effective as possible. But I don't see it being effective right now. Is that what people in DC, like the circles that you run in, I mean, is that how they're thinking about it, or do they have a different view being on the inside of that machine than guys like me on the outside?
So are we pivoting away from term limits and
Yeah.
sort of the functioning or not of government? Is that the question?
Yeah.
And I think I alluded to this several minutes ago. I think that you would probably find a consensus, a large consensus of folks like me who occupy the federal market space, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who represent various constituencies, whether or not that be firefighters or Google, like, and everybody in between.
Yeah.
But those of us who are in that federal marketplace looking to advocate for policies which benefit our clients, our constituent, our membership, whatever, that the levers of government, the bureaucracy of government is not working nearly as efficiently as it could or as it should.
And obviously it has in the past.
Yeah, I mean, look, democracy and representative government and the execution of government thereof is like, it's not pretty. Like we are not a command and control economy like, China or like, Russia. The technocrats that are running China at this point have an immense amount of efficiencies that we will never have. Because we've otherwise endowed various other folks to have an opinion, to have a say, to otherwise like go push the envelope and be, counter to the prevailing wisdom, if you will. They don't have that over there. And so while they're able to push forward in a much more, expeditious manner, you can argue or not as to whether or not our system, still is the best and makes the most sense. I happen to think it does, but it's messy, and I would say that it's not running on all cylinders right now.
And kind of going back, that I'm glad you said that, because it's so messy, it's even more important that we're not so pegged in our corners.
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying?
That's true.
So and I'm just going to say this as an aside, then we can keep going. You remind me a lot of my father-in-law. He's been dead for 10 years now, but he was very liberal Democrat. But he wasn't even a politician. He was one of those statesmen. He looked like a statesman. He talked like a statesman. He had that even keel, much like you do, which I assume you probably need to have that to be successful in DC. I'm a little bit too much of a up and down. I get excited too much. I probably wouldn't do well in your job. But he used to, when we used to have those dinner conversations, he would just sit there and just wind me up and just watch me and he would just sit there calmly, because he knew more about my side of the argument than I did, right? So anyway, you kind of remind me of him, just kind of sitting there even. I'm all getting all fired up.
I have heard many legendary stories about your father-in-law from both Mimi and yourself, and I will absolutely take the compliments.
Yeah, yes, it was a compliment. All right, definitely that was good stuff about politics, policy, ideology, partisanship. Let's bring it now into the practical real world. What, in your opinion, based on your experience going back and forth to DC and with all the people that you talk to, what is the environment like there in terms of partisanship and politics under Donald Trump, under Washington, DC, under the Donald Trump umbrella?
So, irrespective of how you feel about Donald Trump, any political observer I think will tell you that he has fundamentally altered the political terrain out there. He has reoriented the Republican Party to where it is as much, a party of Trump as it is, a traditional Republican Party of, say, Reagan. He has catalyzed a level of opposition that is, to my mind, largely unprecedented. The only other example that I can really think of in my experience is probably that which met, George Bush in circa 2006 and cascaded into 2008's election. And that was on the heels of the, Iraq War, the frankly floundering of the Afghan campaign, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and so the dam was breaking for him, and not only Democrats, but obviously a fairly large swath of unaligned voters. So, with that said, what I found interesting over time is that Donald Trump's polling numbers are as predictable as the weather here in San Diego. He sort of hovers in between about 43 to 47% approval ratings, irrespective of what he does or says.
Yeah.
Sure, he dips occasionally.
Right.
Excuse me. Too much coffee. He dips down to 41.
Yeah.
He'll spike to 51, but he is immensely consistent. And I found that to be super interesting, and not anything that I've otherwise sort of reviewed during most of my experience in politics. The other thing that I found to be interesting is, again, irrespective of what he does or says, his base, Republican, self-described conservatives, remains as absolutely bedrock as anything that I've seen in Republican or in politics, Republican or Democrat.
Really?
Oh my God! Ronald Reagan could only hope for the firm, terra firma polling support that he has.
And I've always thought that to be the case with the Democrats as well. I mean, regardless of who's on the ticket. No? Okay.
I don't see that.
Okay,
I don't
interesting.
see that. I mean,
Well, maybe not right now
Donald,
because who they've got running that, whatever.
I would say there are a few takeaways. Donald Trump as a politician is an absolute tour de force. Again, whether or not you think he's a despicable man, as I do, or you support him, he is a political phenom. So that's one. One of the key takeaways, and I like to sort of point this out, and I don't think that it is good for our culture long term, and certainly not good for our politics. One of the key lessons of Donald Trump is you never have to apologize as a public figure. And you can point to sort of this, blackface issue in, Virginia with the governor and I think the attorney general. There are several other politicians which, were beating up on their wives, cheating up on their whatever it is. The lesson of Donald Trump is don't give an inch, don't acknowledge it, certainly don't apologize, attack the media and your accusers, and frankly the American public will, in a fairly short amount of time, just see it in the rearview mirror. I don't think that is healthy as a culture when our most public faces who we sort of are looking to for leadership and direction refuse to acknowledge that they have foibles.
I would personally throw in that's everybody in there. I mean, that's not just him, in my view. But I hear what you're saying. One of the things I wanted to add, and I wanted to get your take on it, you were talking about, him just being kind of as this DC hasn't seen anybody like him in the past. One of the things, and it's obviously no secret that I support him. One of the things that I find...
Well, now it's not.
No, they know. They know from my...
Do they know?
Yeah, from somebody.
Cat's out of the bag?
Yeah. But what, like with all the stuff...
You still have viewers then?
Don't listen to that.
Yeah.
But the fact that he is so, hey, that he can just stand there and take the pounding that he's taking because he's got a position that he doesn't waver from. Now, we can argue, obviously, whether that's the right position or the wrong position, but the firmness of his position in the face of the immense backlash, not the right word, but the immense opposition from all sides, it seems like. That to me is, because no other traditional politician has ever done that. They have eventually acquiesced to whichever way the wind is blowing. So, anyway. So what guys like you that go into DC and have to talk to, I would assume you're talking to politicians from both sides of the aisle. How is the Donald Trump DC and how it operates, how is that making your job harder? Is it making, what's kind of like where the rubber meets the road, when you're talking to a Democrat and then you walk into a Republican's office, do you get a sense, or is your business different enough and kind of outside of that enough where it actually doesn't matter?
This is an excellent question. And I'm going to try and tie up maybe a couple of things that I've said on the show thus far. So as I've mentioned, the mechanics of government, the levers of government, how government is actually supposed to work, move down the proverbial train tracks. It's not efficient at this point. I won't say that it's broken completely, but it is not efficient. That is, as a top-line matter, really the result of this hyper-partisan era that we find ourselves in. With respect to me personally, I'm going to sort of, take the flip side of the argument though. With respect to my clients who it is I otherwise talk to, most of the stuff that I do is relatively nonpartisan. So I had mentioned at the top of the show, I represent a number of folks in the semiconductor space. These are folks that make advanced integrated circuits and microelectronics, logic, analog, memory, radio frequency, and otherwise. Those aren't Democratic or Republican issues. What it is are matters of priority, intersections of interest. Again, nobody does anything in Washington because Nick asked them to. Now, that's not to say I don't have a partisan stripe. I used to work for the Democratic National Committee, right? Like I've worked for 2 Democratic members of the United States Congress.
And notice how I'm not even holding it against you.
Well,
we're having a great conversation.
I guess we'll see what happens after this. The skewers are out for me. But to be quite honest and fair, and we've talked about this. I am not of a liberal bent, right? Yeah. I'm not of the new progressive, sort of Democratic majority at this point. My politics are much more closely aligned with the middle, with the sort of Clinton mold of politics of the 90s.
Yeah.
And that's really sort of where I, broke my teeth and, made my sweat.
Yeah. So, all right, so that was going to be the last question I was going to ask you. So I'm going to ask you the question, but then I also want you to first answer it with, who do you think out there in the Democrat Party is somebody that you think of in that 90s sort of Clinton depth? So the question is, what do you think of the new, right now for me, watching everything on the news, people like AOC, it blows my mind. But she seems to be the face. I mean, she seems like she's taking over. Now, what is your take on the new Democratic? I mean, what, as opposed to the type of Democrats that you are used to dealing with, or that you kind of have cut your teeth with, like you were just saying. What's your take on the new, or the current Democratic Party? Let's call it that, the current Democratic Party.
So, if you would indulge me for a moment, because you've asked several questions. You've asked about personalities. You've asked about sort of, profile of, the party. The last 100 years have really seen two great political movements, and I do mean that. One was the, birth of the Democratic Party of the early 30s with FDR, which otherwise, promulgated things like Social Security and the, Civilian Conservation Corps, and, extended decades and ended up passing the civil rights legislation and Medicare. The great political movement that we know as the Republican Party traditionally today really started with Barry Goldwater and challenging, pushing back against, that New Deal era and those policies and programs. And, probably extended through certainly Newt Gingrich, 1994, and, George W. Bush. That was sort of a bookend. I would otherwise argue that both parties today are largely living off of legacies in terms of policies, right? Like, the Democratic Party is, for good or for bad, and I think there's both, the grand defender of, civil society programs, Medicare, Social Security. Republicans are a party that still looks to a Reagan-era agenda of, robustness and national security, libertarian sort of laissez-faire economic values, and, Christian conservatism. I don't know that either party has really done the soul-searching necessary to come up with an agenda that is fit for the 21st century.
That makes sense.
I think that the Republican Party today has really turned inward and defined tribe, if you will, and those that are with us as an ever more narrow view. I think that the Democrats, unfortunately, and after an hour and almost 15 minutes and several mugs of coffee, I can say has turned into a party that has been really balkanized and based on interest groups as opposed to some common thread or ethos. I find that to be unfortunate. And so I think that there is ripe a time of reassessment, reinvention. I don't know what the catalyst is for that. I don't know that it can actually happen under today's rubric.
I'm hopeful. What type of catalyst other than what we see? If these aren't going to do it,
it's a perfect point.
I'll tell you what. Let's leave it at that, dude. This was awesome. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. I'm delighted.
Let's definitely do this again because I've got a whole list of questions that I didn't even get to. So,
anytime, my friend.
Appreciate it, brother. Thank you. All right, so, ladies and gentlemen, that was Nick Leibham. Thank you very much. We'll finish off by saying this. If you're in the military, the police, or first responders, if that's you out there, thank you very much for everything that you do. We really appreciate it. Stay safe. Until next time, this is the Rain Man. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching Rain Man's Take, observations on the world we live in. If you like the content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. You can also follow Rain Man's Take on Instagram at Rain Man's Take Also, check out our website at www.rainmanstakepodcast.com and send your comments to rainmanstake@gmail.com. Keep an eye out for future podcasts, which will be coming out every Thursday at 5 p.m. West Coast time.